Right now, as you are watching this video, something is happening in the Persian Gulf that has never happened in modern history. Something so significant, so economically catastrophic, that the ripple effects will reach your bank account, your grocery store, your fuel pump, and your retirement savings, whether you live in New York, London, Dubai, or Karachi. The world's most important waterway is effectively shut. The system that has kept the US dollar as the king of global trade for over 50 years is cracking at its foundation. And the most terrifying part, most people have absolutely no idea this is even happening. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly what is collapsing, why it matters more than any war you have ever seen on television, and what you need to do right now to protect yourself. Stay with me, because what Iran did in the final chapter of this story will change the rules of the global economy forever. Let us go back to the beginning. Not the beginning of this week, not even the beginning of this year. To understand what is breaking apart right now, you need to understand what was built 50 years ago. In 1974, the United States made a deal with Saudi Arabia, a quiet, powerful, world-changing deal. America would provide military protection to the Saudi kingdom, sell them weapons, guarantee their security. In return, Saudi Arabia would do one thing. They would only sell their oil in US dollars. And because Saudi Arabia was the center of OPEC, every other oil-producing nation followed. Suddenly, every country on earth that needed oil, which was every country on earth, had to hold US dollars to buy it. The dollar became not just a currency, it became the language of global energy. This was the petrodollar system. And for 5 decades, it gave America extraordinary power. America could print money, run deficits, and still maintain global dominance because the world needed dollars to survive. That system right now, in March of 2026, is under the most serious attack it has ever faced. Here is what happened. In late February of 2026, the United States and Israel launched a series of coordinated strikes deep inside Iranian territory. These were not warning shots. These were surgical eliminations. Ali Khamenei, Iran's supreme leader of nearly 5 decades, was killed. Major military commanders were taken out. Iran's nuclear infrastructure was degraded significantly. From a purely military standpoint, Israel and the U.S. achieved what analysts had debated for years. They decapitated the leadership structure of their most powerful regional adversary. But here is the thing about war that armchair strategists always get wrong. Winning the military battle is not the same as winning the war, because Iran's response was not what anyone predicted. Iran did not fire a nuclear weapon. Iran did not launch a massive ground invasion. Iran did something far more intelligent, far more calculated, and far more dangerous to the Western economic order. Iran went after the one thing that the entire global economy cannot function without, the Strait of Hormuz. The Strait of Hormuz is a narrow body of water, only 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, sitting between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. On a map, it looks like a tiny bottleneck. In reality, it is the jugular vein of the global economy. Every single day, approximately 20 to 21 million barrels of oil pass through this strait. That is roughly 20% of the entire world's daily oil consumption. Not 20% of Middle Eastern oil, 20% of everything the entire planet burns every single day. This includes the oil that powers Japan's manufacturing sector, the oil that keeps European factories running, the oil that fills American gas tanks, the liquefied natural gas that heats homes across Asia in winter. Everything, all of it, squeezed through this 21-mile channel every single day. And Iran sits right next to it. Iran's military has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. Thousands of anti-ship missiles, naval mines, fast attack boats, underwater drones, all positioned and ready to turn the world's most important waterway into the world's most dangerous one. When Iran began its retaliation, it did not just fire missiles at Israel. It turned the Strait of Hormuz into a no-go zone. By early March of 2026, something extraordinary happened that most mainstream media completely underreported. The world's largest marine insurance consortium, known as the P&I clubs, quietly withdrew coverage for any commercial vessel transiting the Strait of Hormuz. 12 of these clubs, which together provide liability coverage for over 90% of the world's ocean-going shipping tonnage, pulled out simultaneously. Think about what that means in practical terms. A shipping company cannot operate a tanker without insurance. No insurance means no tanker movement. No tanker movement means no oil delivery. Without a single military engagement, without firing a single missile at a tanker, Iran had effectively stopped the flow of oil through Hormuz simply by making the risk so severe that the financial system itself refused to underwrite it. In the first 2 weeks of March 2026, only 77 ships crossed the Strait of Hormuz. Compare that to the normal rate of hundreds of vessels per day. The strait was not physically blocked, it was financially paralyzed. And then the oil price reacted exactly as you would expect. Crude oil crossed $100 a barrel for the first time since 2022. And analysts were not talking about it stopping there. Some of the most respected energy economists in the world began modeling scenarios where oil hits 150, even $180 per barrel if the Hormuz situation does not resolve within weeks. And here is why that number matters to you personally. When oil prices rise by that magnitude, it does not just affect what you pay at the gas pump. It is embedded in the price of everything. Plastics are made from petroleum byproducts. Fertilizers require natural gas. Food transportation runs on diesel. Manufacturing uses energy at every stage. A sustained oil price shock of this scale is essentially a tax on every human being on Earth. The International Monetary Fund estimates that every $10 per barrel increase in oil prices reduces global GDP growth by approximately 0.2%. Do the math on a $60 or $70 price spike. We are talking about hundreds of billions of dollars wiped from the global economy every single quarter this persists. Now, here is where this story takes a turn that most people are not ready for. Because while the financial world was scrambling to process the insurance crisis and the oil price surge, Iran made a move that nobody on mainstream television is talking about clearly enough. Iranian officials began signaling, and in some cases explicitly stating, that tankers wishing to pass through Iranian-controlled waters in the strait would be required to settle payments in Chinese yuan, not dollars. Yuan. This is not just a logistical preference. This is a direct assault on the petrodollar system. Think about it from first principles. If you are a shipping company and you need to transit the strait and Iran is telling you the price of safe passage is denominated in yuan, suddenly you need yuan. Your oil purchase is now potentially denominated in yuan. The dollar's role as the exclusive currency of energy trade begins to fracture. This is precisely what China has wanted for decades. And Iran, with nothing left to lose after losing its supreme leader and taking massive military strikes, was handing Beijing exactly the ammunition it needed to accelerate the de-dollarization of global energy markets. Billionaire investor Ray Dalio has spent years studying the rise and fall of empires and reserve currencies. His framework is not conspiracy theory. It is historical pattern recognition. And in his analysis, there have been consistent warning signs that appear before a reserve currency loses its global dominance. Massive debt accumulation, internal political division, military overreach, trade rivals rising in power, a triggering event that forces the world to question the dominant currency's reliability. By Dalio's framework, the United States checks every single one of these boxes, and he has made a specific historical comparison that should send chills down your spine. He compared America's current situation to Britain in 1956 during the Suez Crisis. In that event, Britain tried to use military force to reassert control over a critical waterway, the Suez Canal. The operation failed diplomatically. The U.S. refused to back Britain. And within years, the British pound had lost its status as the world's reserve currency. Britain went from empire to second-tier power in less than a generation. Dalio is arguing that America may be living through its own Suez moment right now in the Strait of Hormuz. But before we get to what this means for your money and your future, let us complete the military picture. Because the situation in the Gulf states became something that no analyst had predicted with this level of clarity. Iran did not just retaliate against Israel. Iran targeted the Gulf Cooperation Council countries, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, and Oman simultaneously, every single one of them. This was unprecedented. These countries, for all their private frustrations with Iran, had largely tried to maintain some degree of diplomatic distance from the Israel-Iran conflict. They hosted U.S. military bases, yes. They quietly approved of Israeli strikes against Iranian proxies, perhaps. But they were not combatants. Iran changed that calculus entirely. By striking all of them at once, Iran was sending a message. There is no neutral ground in this conflict. If you host American forces, you are a target. If you sell oil in dollars, you are a target. The UAE took particularly significant damage. The Ruwais industrial complex, one of the most strategically important energy facilities in the entire Middle East, was struck by an Iranian drone attack that triggered fires across the refinery zone. ADNOC, the Abu Dhabi National Oil Company, temporarily shut down operations at a facility that under normal conditions produces nearly 1 million barrels of refined product per day. Abu Dhabi International Airport suspended flights for several hours following a separate incident. Dubai, the financial capital of the Middle East, saw its markets open in chaos. The Dubai Financial Market Index dropped sharply. Investors who had parked billions in Gulf real estate, Gulf sovereign bonds, and Gulf equities began pricing in a risk premium that nobody had ever seriously modeled for this region at this scale. Saudi Arabia, the beating heart of the petrodollar system, faced something even more symbolically devastating. The Abqaiq facility, the same facility that was drone struck back in 2019, was targeted again. Abqaiq is the world's largest crude oil processing facility. It handles roughly 7% of global oil supply all by itself. A serious strike on Abqaiq does not just hurt Saudi Arabia. It is a direct shot at the global oil supply chain. When the 2019 attack happened, oil prices jumped 15% in a single day. The 2026 strike renewed all of those fears, and this time the context was far more severe because Hormuz was already effectively closed. Now there is a dimension of this story that goes beyond the military and economic and into the political heart of Washington, D.C., because something happened inside the U.S. government that was almost too remarkable to believe. A senior counterterrorism official, a man named Joe Kent, who served within the Trump administration's national security apparatus, submitted his resignation. And in his resignation, he did not stay quiet. He publicly stated words to the effect of, "We started this war because of pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. And Iran is not actually an existential threat to the United States." For a serving official to say this in public at this moment was extraordinary. It was a signal that even within the coalition that authorized this conflict, there was deep division about whether America had made a catastrophic strategic miscalculation. And the division did not stop at the water's edge. President Trump, who had positioned himself as the architect of a bold new American foreign policy, found himself in a difficult public moment when European NATO allies declined to provide military support for the U.S. naval mission to secure the Strait of Hormuz. France, Germany, Italy, countries that rely heavily on Gulf oil and would theoretically benefit from an open Hormuz, refused to commit warships to the operation. Their calculation was straightforward: getting drawn into a direct military confrontation with Iran in Iranian home waters with no clear exit strategy was not a risk they were willing to take. This left America in the uncomfortable position of potentially having to secure a 21-mile wide strait against a country that has spent 30 years specifically preparing to deny access to that strait, largely alone. And the world was watching to see whether American military power could actually deliver on this promise. Here is why that matters beyond the geopolitics. The credibility of American power is directly tied to the credibility of the petrodollar system. If Saudi Arabia, the UAE, and other Gulf oil producers begin to doubt that the United States can actually protect them and guarantee the free flow of their oil to global markets, they will make alternative arrangements. They already have relationships with China. The yuan-denominated oil futures market in Shanghai has been growing for years, a scenario where Gulf producers begin diversifying even a fraction of their oil sales into yuan, rubles, or other non-dollar currencies is not hypothetical anymore. It is a contingency plan that sits in every Gulf finance minister's briefing folder. The war in the Strait is forcing those ministers to open that folder and read it very carefully. Let us talk about what this means for the global food supply, because this is the part of the story that will determine whether this crisis stays in the realm of financial inconvenience or tips into genuine humanitarian catastrophe. The Strait of Hormuz does not just carry oil and natural gas. It carries nitrogen fertilizers in massive quantities. The Fertilizer Institute has calculated that approximately 50% of global urea exports pass through the strait. Urea is the world's most widely used nitrogen fertilizer. Without it, agricultural yields collapse. Without adequate yields, food prices surge. And food price surges, as we saw in 2022, do not just cause inconvenience in wealthy countries. They cause famines and political instability in developing nations across South Asia, Africa, and Latin America. Pakistan, Egypt, Bangladesh, Ethiopia, countries that import both energy and food, that have limited foreign currency reserves and that have already been struggling with inflation, face the prospect of a cascading crisis that goes far beyond the Gulf region. The shipping industry itself is also fracturing under this pressure. Major shipping conglomerates began rerouting their vessels around the Cape of Good Hope, the southern tip of Africa, to avoid the Gulf entirely. This is the same rerouting response we saw during the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea in 2024. The Cape route adds roughly 2 weeks of sailing time to a journey from the Gulf to Europe, 2 more weeks of fuel costs, 2 more weeks of crew wages, 2 more weeks of delayed delivery. This adds somewhere between $1 million and $3 million to the cost of a single tanker voyage, depending on vessel size. Those costs do not evaporate. They are passed on to consumers at every point along the supply chain. And with Hormuz disrupted and the Red Sea already problematic, the Cape of Good Hope route is now overwhelmed. Shipping rates for the remaining available capacity have surged to levels not seen since the post-pandemic supply chain crisis of 2021. Global stock markets absorbed all of this with predictable alarm. The S&P 500 dropped sharply in the days following the initial escalation. The energy sector naturally spiked, but the broader market reaction told a more complex story. Defense stocks rose, travel stocks fell, airlines, which burn enormous quantities of jet fuel, saw their valuations crushed. Automotive manufacturers with global supply chains began stress testing their logistics for an extended oil disruption. Banks that had extended credit to shipping companies now had to reassess the collateral value of vessels that were essentially parked at anchor, unable to transit the most direct route between producer and consumer. Pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, index funds, all of them suddenly held portfolios that needed to be repriced for a world where the petrodollar system was under genuine, sustained attack. And here is the thing that nobody on television is saying clearly enough. Emergency oil reserves will not solve this problem. Yes, the United States has the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. Yes, the International Energy Agency coordinates among member nations to release reserves during crises. These mechanisms exist precisely for situations like this, and they will be deployed. But reserves are temporary by definition. They buy time. They do not resolve the underlying problem. The underlying problem is that the world's most critical energy choke point is controlled physically and militarily by a country that the United States and Israel have just struck with maximum force. A country that has nothing left to lose, a country that is now led by a new supreme leader who has every political incentive to demonstrate resolve, to show hardness, to prove that Iran cannot be bombed into submission. Reserves give the world perhaps 90 to 120 days of buffer before the pressure becomes truly unmanageable. The diplomatic clock and the military clock are both running, which brings us to the question that every serious geopolitical analyst is asking right now, and that you deserve a clear, honest answer to. Is this the end of the petrodollar era? Here is the honest answer: not immediately. not next month, not next year. Reserve currencies do not collapse overnight. The British pound lost its reserve status over a decade, not a weekend. But the Hormuz crisis of 2026 may well be remembered in future history books as the moment the petrodollar system received its fatal wound. Because what Iran has demonstrated, what China and Russia have taken careful notes on, is that the Strait of Hormuz is a lever that can be pulled. And every time it is pulled, it raises the question, why should the entire global economy depend on a system denominated in the currency of a country that cannot guarantee the physical security of its own energy infrastructure? That question, once seriously asked, begins the process of finding alternative answers. China's yuan-denominated oil futures market will gain more buyers. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and their new members will accelerate their discussions about a commodity-backed trade currency. Gulf states will hedge their relationships more carefully, maintaining their American security umbrella with one hand while building yuan reserves with the other. The de-dollarization process, which has been slow and academic for a decade, has just received a massive real-world stress test. And some of the most respected financial minds in the world believe the system will not pass that test intact. So, what does this mean for you? What should you actually do with this information? Here is what the data tells us. In an environment of sustained oil price elevation, energy sector investments historically outperform physical commodities, gold, silver, real assets tend to hold value when fiat currency systems face credibility challenges. Diversification away from pure dollar-denominated assets becomes more important, not less. For the average person, this means understanding that the prices you pay for food, fuel, and goods over the next 12 to 24 months will be significantly shaped by what happens in the next 60 days in the Persian Gulf. It means building buffer in your pantry, in your emergency fund, in your ability to absorb economic shocks, because the system that has provided relative stability in global trade for 50 years is being stress tested in real time. And now we arrive at the final, most alarming chapter of this story, the one that keeps strategic analysts awake at night. The scenario that nobody wants to say out loud, but that the military and intelligence communities are actively wargaming. Because here is the question that remains unanswered. What happens if the United States attempts to militarily reopen the Strait of Hormuz and fails? The U.S. Navy is the most powerful maritime force in human history. There is no serious debate about that. But the Strait of Hormuz is not the open ocean. It is a narrow, shallow, island-dotted choke point where Iran has spent 30 years deploying asymmetric weapons specifically designed to neutralize American naval superiority, hundreds of anti-ship missiles on land, thousands of naval mines that can be deployed rapidly, fast attack boats, underwater drones, submarine capabilities. Iran's strategy has always been, we cannot defeat the U.S. Navy in a fair fight, so we will make sure there is no fair fight. We will make the strait so deadly, so expensive, so unpredictable that the cost of forcing it open exceeds the political will to do so. The last time America failed to achieve a stated military objective in the Middle East, it pulled out of Afghanistan after 20 years and trillions of dollars. The world noticed. The Strait of Hormuz is not Afghanistan. It is 20 times more economically consequential. And a failure to reopen it would not just embarrass the United States, it would accelerate every trend we have discussed: the yuan's rise, the petrodollar's decline, the repositioning of Gulf states, the reevaluation by every country on earth of whether American military and financial leadership can still be counted on. This is not a video about doom. This is a video about reality. The reality is that the world is at a genuine inflection point. The petrodollar system, the foundation of American economic dominance for 50 years, is facing its most serious challenge in history. The challenge is coming simultaneously from a military crisis in the Strait of Hormuz, from Iran's calculated economic warfare, through the insurance system and the currency demands, from China's patient positioning of the yuan as an alternative, and from the internal divisions within the American political system itself. History teaches us that systems this powerful do not collapse quickly or completely, but they do eventually yield to sustained pressure, to the accumulation of credibility failures, to the patient rise of alternatives. The question is not whether the petrodollar system will eventually be replaced. Economic historians tell us every reserve currency eventually is. The question is whether the Hormuz crisis of 2026 is the beginning of that transition, happening faster than anyone predicted, or whether American power and diplomacy will once again prove capable of restoring order in its most critical arena. The answer to that question will shape the economic reality of every person watching this video for the next decade and beyond. Pay attention, because what happens in those 21 miles of water in the coming weeks is going to matter more to your financial future than almost anything else happening on Earth right now.